Hey guys, we're going to put together another video today. We're going to go over 2.5 ton axles and all the seals that go along with them. That includes the boots, axle seals, hub seals, pinion seals, and everything that pertains to that stuff. There's a bunch of different things to take into consideration when you're sealing up these axles, especially if you're using them in a lot of mud. We're going to cover a few different things, make things a little more clear. We're going to start with the boots here. Alright, this is a basic 2.5 ton axle boot. What it does is it mounts here on the axle tube with a small clamp and then seals the outside of the knuckle. And what that does is it keeps moisture, mud, and any crap from getting into your kingpins, upper and lower, your axle seals, U-joints, all that kind of stuff. Here's an example of one that's not installed yet. It's pretty flexible. These ones are built by Rockwell Off-Road. They're a heavy duty version, they're a thicker material, and they're all one piece. There are also available these typical zipper boots. These were commonly found on the Rockwells from the factory. The military used all these. They're easier to install because you can do them without removing the knuckle. Just undo the zipper, do the clamps. They're a little bit of a pain, especially when everything's covered in grease. And also the zippers can leak. You can silicone them, but you're never going to get a 100% perfect seal, so keep that in mind. We prefer to use the one-piece boots for most of our axles. They're pretty easy to install. You just got to pull the hub, the knuckle, the axle shaft, and by the time you end up getting one of these installed, probably about the same time messing around with a set of zippers. There is one thing I was going to address. There was a few years ago a large batch of these came out on the market that were made from kind of a real light silicone, and guys are having trouble with them, you know, even installing them. They'd tear really easy. These ones aren't like that. They're extremely strong and they'll last a lot longer than, you know, some of those ones you've seen on the market earlier. These are a good high quality boot. They're a little tough to install because they are so thick, but once you get them on there, they'll make a good seal and they'll work really well. Alright, you can see here we've got the boot installed. There's a lip on the inside of the knuckle that boot sits into, and then there's a small wire clamp that holds it in place. Same thing on the inner C on the axle tube. And the thing you have to watch with these boots, same with the zipper ones, is they have a flat spot here. You can see it on the top. That goes to the top and the bottom. There's one there, one there. Some boots will actually say top on it. Once you get that on there, they're a little bit of a bugger, especially these thicker heavy-duty boots. There's a video on YouTube. If you search 2.5 ton axle boot install, it'll run down a few tips and tricks to make this easier to install. I'm not going to go over it because they cover it good in the video. One other thing I wanted to mention with these boots is I know I've had a few guys complain about them tearing or ripping. The thing you have to keep in mind is that even though these are a heavy-duty version, they are still very vulnerable. They are just made out of a rubber material. If they come in contact with a rock or a stick, you know, even the snow wheeling guys that come in contact with a chunk of ice, they will get damaged. There's no doubt about it. Especially here on the bottom where they're most susceptible. If the knuckle comes in contact with something, it'll split it right on the edge here. Basically, the thing you have to keep in mind is if you're having boot trouble, invest in a good set of boot guards. These are some we build in the house. They're nice and thick and sturdy. You can beat on them pretty good. They just bolt onto the lower kingpins here, and they keep the most vulnerable part of the boot protected. For the guys that are really hard on them, we actually make an auxiliary piece. This is more if you're running your steering in the traditional sense. This one's obviously backwards. If the steering is behind the knuckle, you can run these auxiliary guards in the front. It bolts on, protects the front of the boot as well if you're plowing into stuff or there's a lot of sticks where you're wheeling and stuff like that. They work good. We sell them on our website. But if you want your boots to last, you do have to invest in some boot guards. They're just rubber and they are easy to damage. All right, we're going to move on to the inner axle tube seals on a front 2.5 ton. These guys are basically a steel retainer, and the seal presses in from the back side. They press into here. They're a pretty tight fit, so you do have to beat them in. Usually I'll use a chunk of wood or a big brass drift or something to pound them in. Don't hit them with a hammer or anything steel because it will damage this thrust surface that the axle shaft rides against. To get them out, the best way I've found is just get a long chunk of steel bar or something, run it through from the back side and pound them out. From this side you'll probably bugger up the seal, but you're replacing it anyways, so it's not a big deal. You can put a little bit of sealant on the back side to seal it off onto the tube. And the only other thing I was going to mention too is there are a couple different versions of these things available. This one here is for a U-joint style axle shaft up front. This one here, this is for a ball and claw style. It actually uses the thrust ring for the axle shaft on the seal retainer and not on the shaft like the U-joint style does. So the thing you have to keep in mind is if you have one of these, you have to exchange it for one of these U-joint styles. If you decide to go from a ball and claw to a U-joint style shaft, the extra thickness is going to kind of screw you over and you won't be able to get everything bolted up again. And the third one, this is an aftermarket version. What it uses is a different type of seal on the back side and actually allows it to deflect a little better. What we're going to do is we'll go to the other side and I'll kind of show you why this is beneficial to have. Okay, as you've seen on the other side, the only thing inside the axle tube on a stock 2.5 ton is basically just a seal. There's nothing supporting that inner shaft. Different styles of axles actually use a bushing inside of there. Meritors do, Axletechs do. The 2.5 tons don't. The only thing that they use to support these front axles is on the spindles here. There's a bushing inside the spindle that slides on and supports the axle like that. And it does an okay job, but if there's any play in your U-joints or anything else, it's going to start flopping around inside that axle tube. As you can see, on this one it's installed inside the splines, and there's lots of play in there. So it's relying on the spindle bushing to support it. So what that causes for a problem is these factory seals, they're like any typical oil seal, just with a thin lip on it. They don't have a lot of deflection. So if that shaft's flopping around in there at all, what it's going to do is it's going to cause it to leak gear oil inside your knuckle here. And eventually it'll fill up or it'll start leaking out the bottom of the kingpin. If you tear a boot, it'll leak out the boot. It is kind of a messy thing and they don't last very long because the shaft pounding around there will wreck these seals. So what the aftermarket companies have done is they've come up with this different style of seal that'll actually deflect and absorb that wobble inside the inner shaft, and these actually work quite well. It's pretty much solved the leaky 2.5 ton inner axle seal problem that sort of plagued these things from day one. So if you're sick of leaks, these are definitely something to consider. We also get these through Rockwell Off-Road, same as the boots. There was one other thing that I forgot to mention. There is an aftermarket 2.5 ton seal retainer that uses a bushing in it, and it's the Overson one that uses the 2-inch axle shafts. And the problem that I've run into that a lot of guys may or may not know is that as soon as you put a bushing in this outer seal retainer and go to those 2-inch shafts, the machining quality on those Overson shafts is very high and it's very tight. They've done a really good job of machining them, so there's not a lot of play in them. So the thing you have to keep in mind is when you install that 2-inch seal retainer, unfortunately I don't have one here to demonstrate, but with that outer bushing, if this seal retainer plate doesn't fit in there perfect and it doesn't bottom out, what can happen is it'll sit in there a little bit crooked, and as soon as it sits in a little bit crooked, because of the tight tolerances on the machining of those 2-inch shafts, they're going to have a real tough time engaging into the splines. And I've seen all sorts of guys struggle with this. They've ended up pounding those Overson shafts in with a hammer, which is never good. And a lot of the times what I've found the issue is just these aren't properly seated in the housing. So what I like to do is get them started, tap them in good and tight with a wooden block or something so you don't damage them. And then what I like to do is I'll take a brass drift like this one here and I'll go around it and make sure the thing is nice and bottomed out. And you can tell because as you're beating it in, the brass drift will absorb most of it, but as soon as it's bottomed, you'll feel the drift kind of bounce back at you, and you'll know that it's tight in that tube. And typically, if you have troubles with your shafts, your Overson shafts not going in properly, that's the reason why, is because things are not aligned properly. Just on that note, if you do for some reason have an issue, the way to troubleshoot it, because there are other problems that you can run into. For example, a bent axle tube, you know, it's not going to allow those big Overson shafts to slide in there very easy either. But the thing that I always do is slide the shaft in first, make sure that it engages with the splines before you install your seal retainer, and then pull the shaft out if everything feels good there. Take the seal retainer with the bushing in it, put it on the shaft, and make sure that it's good too. Maybe like the guy that machined it didn't bugger up the tolerances of the bushing, make sure that it slides good. And as long as it's bottomed out in there and installed properly, and if the shaft still doesn't go in nice, then I would probably start looking at maybe a bent housing or something along those lines. Just something else to point out, just wanted to make a note of it. All right, now we're gonna go over the 2.5 ton inner hub seals. These are a bit different than what most people are used to. Most guys are used to a hub seal that installs in the hub and then rides on a race of some kind. So the seal itself turns with the hub that's spinning. These ones are backwards. They actually mount on the spindle and the hub spins, but the seal stays stationary. And what it does is it actually fits up against the inner hub bearing race, and this lip is what seals it off. The way they're designed is they do have a little bit of flex in them. You can see here between the steel and the rubber, and what that does, it kind of absorbs, takes up some of the slack, and that's what holds pressure on the seal surface. The thing with these is I don't really like installing them. They're kind of a pain in the ass. You have to be careful with them too, because if you slip and dent the steel part here, what it'll do is it'll ruin that flexible part in there, and you'll end up with gaps along the sealing surface, and it's gonna, you know, leak a bunch of water into your wheel bearings and stuff like that. The best thing that we've come up with is we actually designed a tool for installing these things. You know, it's difficult. You can use a piece of pipe or something maybe and beat on it, but again, if you slip and damage that steel ring, you'll see this one here, it's been bent and you've lost that flex. There's hardly anything left in there, and this seal won't keep water and stuff out. So what we've done to make this a little simpler, a little easier, so you're not wrecking seals and then piling up wheel bearings and stuff like that, is we have this, we call it a seal install tool, and basically it's got two races basically that fit where the bearings ride here and here, and it helps align the tool so when you're installing it, it only pushes on this inner ring, and it won't actually damage the outer part that holds the rubber. So what you do is just install this on the spindle, get everything in place, use your spindle nut, install it on there. Take your hub socket, crank it on there, and then once you tighten everything up, it'll push that seal on properly, and it'll be a good fit. It won't be damaged, and you'll know it's sitting exactly where it needs to be. All right, so now that we've got our inner axle seals installed, our boots are installed, now we're going to move on to our axle shafts. There's a few different versions of the 2.5 ton axle shafts. There's the CV style, U-joint style, and then the ball and claw. And all of them kind of require a little bit different lubrication. The 2.5 ton U-joints are also available from the aftermarket. Rockwell Off-Road again makes a sealed greasable unit, meaning that you can grease it like a typical driveline U-joint. These ones that come from the factory are non-greasable. There's no grease nipple on them. Basically what they rely on is grease getting packed into the needles for lubrication. So what I'll do for the greasable U-joints, because you can pump grease into them from a grease zerk and they're sealed, there's no reason to pack everything with grease. It's not going to do anything, it's not going to go anywhere, and it's just going to kind of make a mess. So what I do is I'll smear a little bit of grease inside the knuckle, just a thin layer, to make sure that everything isn't getting a little bit of corrosion, because it'll start to corrode if it sits there. It's just bare metal, bare cast metal. So give it a little coat of grease just to kind of make sure everything's resistant to rust. And then grease the U-joint, make sure it's got full of grease. And then there's a thrust surface as well. I don't know if you can see it in here, but where the axle shaft sits against that inner seal retainer, it requires grease as well. So you want to make sure you pack it good. You don't want too much because it makes the shaft difficult to seat against the surface, but you want enough that it'll stay there. And then also on the outer stub, this is another thrust surface, so you're going to want a bit of grease and stuff in there. Same with the bushing inside the spindle, you're going to want to grease it too so it's got some lubrication. And then if it's a sealed U-joint, then install it, bolt your spindle up, you're off to the races. If it's a non-sealed U-joint and it's non-greasable like this one here from the factory, what I'll do is I'll pack this all full of grease and make it one big ball of grease. Same thing with thrust surfaces, so that it actually gets some lubrication into those needles as it's running. If it's a ball and claw or the CV style, you can see here, this one, it runs, there's 5 balls if you're not familiar with them, and they pivot on each other. And these things require a pile of lubrication. So when guys tell you to pack the knuckles full of grease, they're talking about these things here. These actually need to have that knuckle completely jam-packed full of grease so that it's constantly getting lubricated. If not, they'll dry up, pile up, and blow up, basically. So you want to make sure of that. Here's this one here is ready to install. You can see I've got everything completely packed with grease. It's ready to slide in there. Same with the thrust surfaces, they're all greased, ready to go in. I know some guys like to silicone their spindles and their kingpin plates. You know, if you're submersed in water and it's, your axles are underwater for an extended period of time, then yeah, I'd go ahead and do that. If you're, kind of just bouncing around, puddle jump and stuff like that, I wouldn't bother. These kingpin caps are going to have a bunch of grease in there if you're greasing them regularly. The spindle surface, it's going to have a little bit of grease in there too. It'll seal it up enough that you're not going to have to worry about it leaking water into there. All right, there's a couple, common misconceptions that, there's a few guys that don't like boots, so they run these axles without them. And I just kind of wanted to address some of the issues with doing that. I know a lot of guys do, and they get away with it, and everything's okay. Obviously your kingpins, you can grease them, grease nipple top and bottom. You can keep them well lubricated, but there's a couple parts in here that you can't lubricate without tearing everything apart. The main one is this spindle bushing. If this thing dries up, it's going to start seizing up on this stub shaft and piling up. And like we explained earlier, this bushing here in the spindle is the only thing that's holding this axle true to its housing. So if it starts wearing out and you get a bunch of slop in there, the axle is going to be flopping around in the housing pretty good. The other thing that's not going to get any lubrication is your thrust surfaces. So when you turn and you start loading those U-joints, it's going to start putting a little bit of thrust on these surfaces. If they're dry or if they're full of dirt and grit, they're going to wear out and it's going to start gulling up and taking material off of here. The front, I do a little bit differently, or I prefer to do a little differently. These outer hub seals, I like to use them on the front. And the reason behind that is if you've had one of these apart, the stub shafts that slide through the spindle, you can see here on the 2.5 tons, there is no seal in here, it's just a bushing. So unlike a Dana axle, there's nothing preventing any moisture, dirt, water, anything from getting through the stub shaft, through the spindle, and then out into your hub bearings and ruining your hub bearings. The only thing that protects water from getting in there is the actual axle boot. So if it gets torn, there's a pretty good possibility you can get a bunch of dirt and crap into your hub bearings. Unless you install one of these seals, all they do is they fit, you take both nuts off, the seal actually fits behind both nuts and clamps on there. It splines, you can see it keys into the little notch in the spindle, and what it does is it seals on the outer bearing race and prevents any moisture and crap from getting in there. It'll fill up a little drive flange here, but shouldn't really hurt nothing if you catch it soon enough. All right, now we're moving on to the pinion bearings. As you can see, I got a chunk kind of half tore down here. We're actually doing seals in it on the bench. You know, pull the yoke off first, 1.5 inch nut. Yoke should slide off pretty easy. Give a little tap with a hammer and it should slide right off of there. And then what I like to check for is any play in your pinion bearings, in and out and up and down. Make sure everything spins smooth. Once you got the seal, you can actually see the bearings inside. Make sure everything looks okay. There's no crap or chunks coming off of it. And usually why I'll do that is because if everything is good and tight, I won't disturb these bearing retainers. As you can see here, there's shims in behind them. And if you start to disturb those shims, they never really seem to go back to the way they should. Dirt will fall in between them where they'll get damaged, and it'll screw up your preload on the bearings, and sometimes they won't seal, they'll start leaking and stuff like that. So if there's no play, I'll just leave them alone. Don't touch them, pull the seals, and just leave them where they are. If there is play, the way I go about doing them is I start from scratch, pull them off, throw the shims away, clean everything up really good, and then if you haven't done one before, get yourself a manual and start from scratch. Make sure that everything's set up properly before you put this thing back in the axle. So anyway, back to the seal, is how I get these things out of here, or how I found that works pretty good, is first clean it up really good. Make sure there's no dirt or crap inside here where the seal's going to slide out of. Once that's cleaned up, what I'll do is, you can see here, this is an old one that I've already pulled. I'll drive a chisel in to the side of the seal just to kind of relieve the pressure on the outer ring. You just have to be really careful that you don't damage this housing. If you do, you can clean it up with a file or some emery paper, but do your best not to damage that. Once you got a chisel in there and kind of broke that seal, you can pry it out with a seal remover. It's just kind of a hook-shaped tool that'll pop that right out of there. Once it's out, clean everything up really good. Make sure it's nice and dry and clean. Grab yourself a new seal. What I like to do is, just in case there is any rust or damage or scratches in here, is I'll put a little silicone or sealant on the outside of the seal before I install it. I don't know, some guys might have a different opinion on that, but I've had good luck with it, so I haven't stopped doing it. And what you'll want to do is obviously take that, tap it in nice and gently, make sure it goes in good and square, and then it's tough to see, but there is actually, it'll bottom out on this face in there. So just go until it stops. Once that's done, install your yoke, install the nut, torque it down good and tight, make sure the cotter pin's in it, and you're good for the pinion seals. Alright, now that we've done the front axle, let's move on to the rear axle. The rear 2.5 ton has a lot in common with the front. The center chunks are the same, the hubs are all identical, meaning that the seals are the same as well. Same seals we went over on the front, just a face seal like this. There is a lip machined on the spindle here where it presses onto. Usually what I'll do is just kind of run your hands over, make sure there's no lips or sharp edges or anything that it's going to catch on. You can set the seal on there. Same thing, use one of our seal installer tools. Slide it onto there. Make sure everything's lined up. Use your spindle nut. Crank it down and install it. Pretty self-explanatory, same as in the last video. And what I'll do is I'll go over here. This hub's already installed. And the difference between the front and the rear, and this is just kind of something that I've done over the years. You know, some people might not agree with it, but from the factory, a lot of the 2.5 tons will come with the outer hub seal in here, the real thin one, same as the front axles. The only difference is that right now the axle shaft slides through everything, and there will actually be an oil level here. Right at the edge of the spindle, you can see the drain plug here. The oil level will get pretty close to that spindle height. So what I like to do is I leave that seal out of there and leave the bearings open. This axle seal surface is sealed to the hub, so nothing can leak through there. And basically what that does is it allows the bearings to ride in a nice oil bath, which is, you know, typically better than grease. The issue that some guys might have with that is that if you end up ripping out this back seal, this inner seal here, is water is going to be able to get itself into the hub bearings, but not only the hub bearings, is it's going to allow itself into the actual axle tube itself. So there is the potential to fill your entire axle with mud. If you're one of the guys that doesn't like to look after your truck and doesn't like to change seals and replace them, then I would highly recommend installing this outer seal so that you only damage your hubs and that it doesn't get through the axle tube and into your center chunk and stuff like that. But the reason that I don't like to run it is because as soon as there's a leak, as soon as this seal starts to show it's a sign of wear, it's going to start leaking. So as long as you're good on the maintenance and you notice that that seal starts to weep a bit, you can knock that hub off there, change it out, put a new one in it before water and stuff ever gets in and damages anything. But you have to be that guy. You have to be really diligent on keeping up on your maintenance. So when I go to install the hub bearings, I will still pack them with grease. I just like to do this because it's not my axle, it's actually a customer's. So it's just a little extra insurance in case he, you know, takes it for a run before everything's full of oil. It gives a little extra insurance. And then what I'll do is I'll use some black RTV on this surface, slide the axle all the way in, bolt it down, and everything will be sealed up nice. Same thing with center chunk, as we explained on the front axle. Just black RTV in here. You know, don't be too shy with it. Make sure it seals because you'd hate to have to pull it apart, and you definitely don't want water getting into that surface. And same with, you know, your top cap and all that. Make sure you use some black RTV in there. Gaskets aren't real important. And what I like to do is, if you do have your axle totally torn apart and cleaned up all 100%, is I prefer to fill them through this top cap until it comes out the fill plug here. Then you know that you got this cavity in here. There's a separate cavity. Get it all full of oil, fresh oil, and you know everything's going to be happy and healthy. What I wanted to cover was the vents on these 2.5 ton axles. They can kind of cause some problems sometimes. What happens is, if you don't allow your axles to breathe properly as they heat up and the air expands inside of them, what they'll do is they like to push oil out of the, you know, whatever seal is the most susceptible. So typically a pinion seal, it'll start puking oil out of there. And then of course when it cools down, it'll draw air, or if you're underwater or something, it'll draw that water into the axle, which causes problems. So I highly recommend don't plug these off. I've seen some guys, they'll use these little accordion boots. I'll post a little picture of it here. And you know, some guys get away with it. I'm not a big fan. Those little accordion boots are actually designed to be used on like an Arctic Cat ATV. So the differential was only about this big. So obviously, as you can tell, there's not a whole lot of air expanding and contracting in there. Whereas a 2.5 ton, if you get it a little bit warm, there's not going to be enough room in that bellow to absorb all that extra volume of air, and it's probably going to start leaking. So what I've found that works best is we use just a 1/4 inch air brake line. It's quite flexible, but it's not soft like a rubber hose or anything like that. So if you're running zip ties around it, it won't crush it and close it off. And we'll just use a little compression fitting, stick the hose in there, and it's cheap enough. You can buy a whole roll of this for almost next to nothing. You can route it right up into your cab, someplace that's dry, out of the moisture and stuff like that, and it'll still allow your axle to breathe properly. We have a kit online if you want to check it out. It comes with everything you need to replace this little fitting, and it comes with a lot of hose, enough to do 2 axles. And the one last thing I was going to mention, a lot of the 2.5 tons, they come with a vent here in the axle tube, but some of the older ones came with a vent here in the side of the differential. And the thing you have to be careful of is if you're not paying attention, you end up putting a top hat kit on this or something and remove this plate or cover this plate, you'll inadvertently plug off that vent and you could end up with, you know, leaky axle seals, leaky pinion seals, and that's probably part of the problem. So you're going to want to put either the vent back in there in your top hat kit or stab one through your differential tube just so your axle can breathe.